Tonight we have Professor Jennifer Smith from Glasgow University, who's a linguist, and she started off teaching English in Greece for a number of years, and then came back and decided that she quite liked linguistics, so she did an MA in Durham and then a PhD in York and wound up in Glasgow. She's originally from Buckie, so she's experienced quite a wide range of accents in her time. And so I don't know if anybody had a chance to look at the Speak for Yersel website and have a go at it. I see nods and head shakes, but it's quite good fun. I've had to go at it twice and I don't come up with the same answers every time, but maybe I shouldn't admit that. Anyway, I'll hand it over to Jennifer.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really pleased to be here. And I'm always pleased to get a shout out for Buckie. So folks, as we move increasingly online, as our lives move increasingly online, what we find is that in terms of research, it's sometimes conducted in a different way now. So if we think if we're researching particular phenomena, what you normally had in the past was you would turn to the experts to find out about the galaxy or about a particular thing in language. But as we're moving more and more online now, what you're beginning to see with research is this idea of crowdsourcing. So I don't know if you've come across the word crowdsourcing, have you? You've definitely come across the word crowdfunding. You've probably all taken part in it, but crowdsourcing. So if we look at the definition of crowdsourcing, a tiny writing, I'll read it out for you. This is from the Oxford English Dictionary, and it says the practice of obtaining information or services by soliciting input from a large number of people, typically via the internet. And then it finishes by saying, often without offering compensation. There's no pay here, you do it for free. So the idea with crowdsourcing is that speaking to 5,000 people is better than speaking to 10 people. You're reaching out to the crowd, or you might have heard of it referred to as hive mind as well. You see that expression, the hive mind. So of course, one of the biggest projects in crowdsourcing that we all know about is Wikipedia. That is a crowdsourced resource, reaching out to the crowd to put the pages up on various phenomena. And it used to be with Wikipedia, 15 years ago, I would always say to my students, do not go onto Wikipedia, it's rubbish. And now I say, go onto Wikipedia to start with. It's such a brilliant resource. It's really good in terms of what's on there. And one of the things that Wikipedia has is a website dedicated to crowdsourcing projects. And there's hundreds and hundreds on here, but in fact, that's just a little tiny percentage of the number of crowdsourced projects that are out there in the world today. Here's one of my particular favourite ones, the Milky Way project, and it's getting people to look at images and identifying wind bubbles, stellar wind bubbles in the Milky Way. I want to have a go at that one to see. So again, this idea of you reach out to the crowd to try to harness the information that they have and the knowledge that they have. So is this sounding okay, Claire? Yeah, because I'm moving back and forth a little bit. So there's also started to be, and I would say probably it's fairly recent, maybe in the last 15 years, there's started to be crowdsourcing research on dialects, okay? Collecting information on dialects. And I don't know if any of you have done this was the New York Times quiz, about maybe 5 years ago? It was pre the plague, I'm sure. It was about 5 years ago it came out. And it's still live, you can still go on and do it. and you answer a series of questions, and it's able to pinpoint where you're from the series of linguistic questions. It's a really brilliant website. I'm pretty much sure it's still live. And there are various other crowdsourced projects, not only for English, but in Europe, in North and both South America, collecting data from people, reaching out to the crowd to get information on dialect data. Now, if we look at projects on dialects, what you find is these are not new. They've been around for, I think the first ones took place in the 18th century, around about that time. So people have been interested in dialects and how they vary and how they change for a number of centuries now. But what you normally get with these is you get face-to-face data collection, as we call it. So the expert, the linguist, goes out, meets people face-to-face and asks them about their dialect. Here's a brilliant picture. This is the Survey of English Dialects. It started in around 1940 and finished in the 1950s, where this guy here with the car coat, he literally got on his bike and went round farms in Yorkshire talking to farmers and talking about the language they used, and further afield in Yorkshire as well. So you normally get this face-to-face, okay, set up by the linguist, but now what we're moving towards is much more a quick and dirty throwing something out there and seeing what we can get back from these online platforms, the online crowdsourced platforms. But if you think, folks, about language, it's actually a highly, highly complex thing. I love this cartoon. Let me look at that. And the key thing there is curse sounds which the human mind cannot comprehend. And when you say to folk, language is this really complicated, complex thing, they're like, what? But we all do it, it seems easy. But in actual fact, it really is incredibly, incredibly complex. And the rules we have in our heads that allow us to do this thing, this sound coming out of our mouths all the time, is just incredibly complex. And we know that from, if any of you have tried to learn a foreign language, who's learned a foreign language? It's fiendishly difficult, right? And we're all a bit rubbish at it. Well, I speak for myself there. It's really, really a difficult thing. But what happens with language as a child is that we are little linguistic geniuses, and we are able to pick up this highly, highly complex thing within really the first 4 years of life. We become pretty fluent in our language, despite the complexities. And we really only know the complexities when we start to think about language consciously. So for example, if you have something really simple like, she's there, and then we want to make that a negative, so we would say, she's not there. But if we have another sentence like, I love you, we don't say, I love not you, or I not love you. We say, I don't love you. Now, luckily, none of us are ever thinking about that every day in our lives, right? Because otherwise our minds would explode and we would never say anything out of our mouths. So there's a ton of complex things in the language structure. It really is one of the most complicated things. And another point about language is it's only humans that can do this thing called language. Now, loads of you would be like, my dog speaks to me every day, right? But a dog can tell you that they're hungry or they need to go out to pee, but a dog can't tell you what they did yesterday or their hopes and dreams for the future. All these amazing things we do with language on an everyday basis. So it's highly, highly complex. So if you've got this crowdsourced resource and you've got this highly complex structure of language, does it work without the expert there guiding you through to the particular questions, etc., that you want answered on that? And that's really important, because if you think of crowdsourced data, the quick and dirty, it's key that, so Brunt and Meidel say here, if we're to rely on crowdsourcing to gather information, we need to make sure that the information is truthful, accurate, and representative. What are we getting from the crowd on a particular phenomenon? So if we think about language, given the relatively uncontrolled context in which data are collected, how, and when I say data there, I just mean the language. How reliable is crowdsourcing in documenting the complexities of language use? And I'm going to show you more about how language is complex in a minute. So, it's with these questions in mind that we turn to Speak for Yersel, the thing I'm finally got around to what I'm going to tell you about today. And there is the opening page. Some of you have already been on and looked at the resource. And in the opening page it says, Speak for Yersel aims to capture the different words, sounds and sentences used in Scots across Scotland and people's reactions to these. We're going to be talking about the first part there today, the words, sounds and sentences used across Scotland. So if that is the aim, one of the first things we have to do is say what we mean by Scots. Because when you hear discussions on Scots, there's a lot of different opinions about what is Scots, and also there's kind of weird ideas about Scots. So what I'm going to give you is a little what is Scots according to the linguists, a little primer on that. So there we are. What is Scots? I'm going to give you a little, not a brief history of time, a brief history of Scots. Although it might be quicker to do a brief history of time. So really crucial, folks, to understanding Scots in the present day is what we have, what we call the Scots linguistic continuum. And at one end of the continuum, we have Scottish Standard English, and at the other end of the continuum, we have Broad Scots. And if we define those linguistically, Scottish Standard English is said to be English, but with a Scottish accent. So the words are the same generally as Standard English, and the sentence structures are the same, but there's particular pronunciations, or phonology as we call them in linguistics, that are little clues to us being from Scotland. Okay, so at the Broad Scots end of the continuum, you have something different. And that means that this version of Scots differs across words, sounds, and structures from Standard English. It's highly differentiated if you compare it to Standard English. So at the Broad Scots end, you might have someone like in Glasgow, instead of child or bairn, you'd have Wayne. And I don't, is it Wayne in Perth as well? No, okay. I like that definitive. Absolutely not. Wayne. So different words. You have different pronunciations. Cat, the cat, for cat. And you have different grammatical structures. So in Glasgow, they're gonna know, or gonna you. Have you heard that one? Gonna you do that, or gonna know do that. So it differs at all these levels. So who thinks from that quick linguistic description, who would say they're more at the Scottish Standard English side of the continuum? A show of hands. Yeah. Any would put themselves at the Broad Scots end? Okay, one, yay! Okay. And the other thing about this is, at the Scottish Standard English end, we have what you call homogeneity. So people, regardless of whether they're from Aberdeen or Perth or Glasgow, sound quite similar to each other. But at the Broad Scots end of the continuum, you have this other dimension, which is geography. And that means that a Broad Scots speaker from Perth versus a broad Scots speaker from Aberdeen versus a better get my geography right, Aberdeen, Buckie versus a broad Scots speaker from Glasgow sound radically different to each other. So there's homogeneity at the standard Scottish English side and heterogeneity at the broad Scots side. You get all these different dialects basically at the broad Scots side. And we often see, something like this as a stylisation of the different dialects across Scotland. I'm going to return to that northwest part later on in the talk. So we've got broad Scots, Scottish Standard English, but we also have something else. So here is me now, and the way I'm speaking now is basically, this is my posh lecturing voice, right? So I'm probably pretty much towards the Scottish Standard English end. But when I go home, I don't sound like Asata. I sound awful different when I go home. So when I go home to Buckie, I'm speaking like ass, and you maybe when I even came what I'm saying I know. Okay? So what we've got in the Scottish linguistic situation is we've got this continuum, but people can often move up and down that continuum. They can slide up and down. And all of us have this ability. It's called linguistic style shifting. So depending on who you're talking to, what you're talking about, etc., you might have a more formal voice, or down the pub you might have your more informal voice. So we all have these little, we've got this ability to style shift, and most of us just do a little move like that. But in somewhere like Aberdeen or Shetland, the move is gigantic from the Scottish Standard English end in one time, what I'm doing now, rach doing to fit a div when I go back to Buckie. You get this, it's called, you often get what we call bi-dialectal speakers in particular areas across Scotland. So you can see, folks, there's a lot of complexities. You know, we're a nation of 5.5 million people only, but the linguistic complexities within that are off the scale. Really, really pretty amazing. So we have those linguistic facts, but layered on top of that as well, and what's influencing how we sound and what comes out of our mouths is attitudes towards the different varieties in how people sound. So here is one attitude. What is Scots? It is MacPidgeon English. Okay, this was in reference to, there was a big Twitter spat about there being a Scots question on the 2022 census. This is what it was in relation to. And this may be part of, we know that attitudes has a big effect on how you sound, and this may be part of the Scottish cringe. It's got its own wiki page, the Scottish cringe, where sometimes if we hear like a Glaswegian or ourselves recorded, we're cringing away. Oh, I didn't sound right, as we might say. So we have negative attitudes towards Scots, both about ourselves and about others, how they sound. But at the same time, there's another pool, there's another pool going on. Whoa, wow. There we are. And this is the Scottish football team for the, you can tell I know nothing about football now. It was the World Cup, wasn't it? Was it the World Cup like? Euros, there I am, totally show my ignorance here, the Euros. And I think, folks, that what happened there was quite indicative of Scotland more generally. So we kind of knew that we were a bit rubbish, right? And at the same time, we kind of loved ourselves, right? There was a two-way pool going on there. So you see with attitudes, it's not the case that it's just all negative, oh, that doesn't sound right. There's a pull towards positivity about Scots in general, and part of that is the Scots language. So you get all of these tensions pulling and pushing within this highly, highly diverse situation of Scots spoken across Scotland. Does that make sense so far? Okay. So it's with this in mind, these dynamic complexities, that we wanted to see what we would get in crowdsourced data through looking at Scots. So if we go back to Speak for Yersel, and here is the Speak for Yersel team. Shout out especially to Mary, the research assistant on the team. All you need to know is she did all the work. And I just come here and get all the glory. So a really brilliant team to work with. And if you haven't gone on already, there is 30 questions to do with words, 30 to do with pronunciation, and 30 to do with sentence structures. And the questions look something like this. If you're talking to family and friends, are you more likely to say down like noun or noon? So do you say down or doon? And notice as well, folks, we've taken this highly complex thing called Scots or language, and we've really boiled it down to very simplistic questions as part of this crowdsourced data. So those are the kinds of questions. So we launched this old thing called Twitter. We launched in October 2022. We didn't know, sometimes these things die a death and no one goes on and does them, right? We didn't know what would happen. But on day one, this was a question on how you pronounce ball. So you can get ball or you can get ba and ba. Exactly, yeah. So northeast is ba and Shetland is ba. But in Glasgow it's ball, and then the standard is ball. So we were super excited because we had dots on the map. So when you answer, you'll have seen this, folks, the dot appears dynamically on the map to map your answer. So we were really excited about this, and then day two, hey, we had tons of dots. So it really took off, and people are kind of interested in language, right? We have this vested interest in it. Something that all of us do. And if you go to the pub, you're not going to strike up a conversation about nuclear physics, but people talk about language all the time. Okay, it's just really really intuitively interesting for us. So within the first 2 weeks, we had about 5,000 respondents answer the questions on our surveys. We were delighted with that. But one of the first things we wanted to ask is, who are these people? Because in reaching out to the crowd, you want to make it as representative as possible. So you're saying you want to talk about Scots. You want to reach out to all possible Scots speakers, the best cross-sample across the land, not just a particular group of people. So what we did was we had this census data from 2022, and we compared it to our initial 5,000 respondents to see if we were reaching out across a cross-sample. And here is region, and you can see there, folks, that we're doing pretty well with region. So it's starting with, it's a very small writing bit, starts with Glasgow, the most populous, and goes right along to Orkney at the end, the most to least populous from left to right. And you can see that we're pretty good in terms of reaching out across Scotland. It pretty much maps onto the census data in terms of populations within particular areas. There's a couple of bumps. One of the bumps is Murray. That'll be Bucky. I basically got all my friends and family to complete the survey. And then the other bump is Dundee. And there's an activist, a Scots language activist, Ali Heather. I think he reached out to a lot of people. So we've got 2 bumps in there, but doing pretty well. And in terms of age, we also do pretty well. It's not surprising that the 0 to 9 years old, they didn't do it, right? They're absolutely not interested. We have also, you're not going to get, it goes 80 plus year olds, although I did make my dad do it. It's not surprising at these ends that we haven't quite got the numbers, but a pretty good mix of age as well. They're not all younger speakers, for example. They're not all in their 20s, a pretty good mix. We don't have many 10 to 19-year-olds, and we think it just wasn't cool enough, Speak for Yourself, for them to do. They were back to playing like Call of Duty. So, and in terms of gender, we did pretty well as well. Slightly more females compared to males, but pretty good on that measure as well. But when we get to education, we see something different. And we ask the question, when you register, if you've already done it, you'll have seen, we ask the question, did you go to uni, did you not go to uni? A very quick and dirty, simple question that's really a proxy for class, right? But it's very quick and dirty, that one. And you'll see there that in the census, about 30% of people in Scotland have gone on to higher education. But in our data, about 70% of people completed the survey that have gone to university. So that means the results we get have to be viewed through this lens of, we haven't got a good cross-section with education, right? We have to view the results in that way. So not bad apart from education in terms of demography. So that's the representativeness that's important, not bad at all. So then the next question we wanted to ask is, well, who speaks Scots? Because again, there's a lot of things, now you have that idea in your head of what is Scots? It's this big continuum of use. You do not have to sound like Burns to say you're a Scots speaker, right? It's this big umbrella idea of Scots. So we wanted to say who speaks Scots, who's using the forms that we know are particularly Scots, and I'll show you those in a minute. So if you go to, is the Scots Language Centre still here in the library? No, must have moved. This is the Scots Language Centre. Maybe it's probably all online now, actually. Yeah. So this is a typical example of a description of who speaks Scots. So it's spoken today throughout the east and south of the country, the historic lowlands, and also in Orkney and Shetland, which form the Northern Isles. So what that means, folks, is that it's said that Scots isn't spoken throughout Scotland. It's spoken basically, this one I showed you earlier, here. So what you find there is that in this spot, like you can't see it, but there, in the north and west, that is said to be Highland English. Note it's not Highland Scots spoken there, it's Highland English. And there's a very good historical reason for that, and it's this, right? So in those areas in the west and north and the Western Isles, they were traditionally Gaelic speaking, right? Of course, it used to be that all of Scotland was Gaelic speaking, and then it got pushed westwards and northwards. They were Gaelic speaking. So when they went to school, they learned English. They didn't learn Scots. So they learned a very standard form, okay? They weren't sounding like the Glaswegians or the folk for Dundee or Perth. They were, well, Perth's a little bit in the middle there. They were learning a very standard form. So when you listen to Highlanders now, is anybody here from the Highlands? Yeah?
Argyll.
Sorry?
Argyll.
Oh, Argyll, okay, yeah. Okay. And when you hear, especially further up, when you hear it, it sounds that very crisp. And there's the light dells, for example, etc. But it sounds very standard, right? Very easy to understand, etc. So this is why we say Scots isn't spoken there. And in descriptions of Scots, these areas are completely ignored. But we wanted to test empirically whether that was the case or not. Is it the case that they're not using any Scots forms there? So, testing who speaks Scots where. So we looked at a series of pronunciation forms and a series of sentence structure forms. And the pronunciation forms were these ones. So down is, more is, head is, make is, etc. Right? You all know them. You might not use them, but you all know them, and there they all are there. And these folks, the fact that you, who would use those Scots forms, by the way? Okay. Slow admittance. Yeah, okay. So, and the really important thing about those folks is those are what we call overt Scotticisms. And what we mean by that is we all know about them and we all notice them and we all comment on them. So if someone were to say something like, what does Scots sound like? You might say, oh, they say hame rather than home. Okay, overt Scotticisms. They're at the high level of consciousness. We all notice them. So here we have the question on those. It would be something like this. Do you pronounce down more like noun or noon? And spoiler alert, I'm going to show you a graph now. And we found this. And note, folks, that the dark bar is people saying, no, I don't say doon and mare and stain. I say down and more and stone. And that is about 65% of our respondents only used the standard form, didn't use the Scots form. But then what we wanted to do was, for that question of who speaks Scots where, what we did was we divided the data into geographic region. And the next graph I'm going to show you goes from Dumfries and Galloway down in the southwest, right up to Shetland in the northeast. So we go from southwest up to northeast. That's along the bottom of the graph. So if we have a look, and we see this here, and we see that nearly all of the regions use at least some of the Scots forms, doon and mare and stain. But two that stick out are the Highlands and the Western Isles, where there's just, the light blue lines are tiny, you know, it's less than 5% there. So that means that people, about 95% of the time, are saying, no, I say down and stone and round. So it looks to, and if we look at that visually, we see that the, so this is percentage divided up by 25s, and we see that that Highlands and Western Isles looks very different from the rest of the country in terms of reporting. They're saying they're not doing it at all, really. So in actual fact, who speaks Scots where, we see that this map looks like this one, where people report to speak Scots. They are not using those highly prolific, endemic, iconic, I would say, Scots forms. So, seemed like, okay, the books saying this for hundreds of years are probably right. But then we wanted to look at sentence structures. So I'll give you a minute to look at these. All right, yeah, a translation into standard English for the first one. That's exactly, it's like you're a plant in the audience. I love you. This is exactly right. So notice, folks, when we did the pronunciation ones, you were all on it and telling me what the Scots forms are. Now faced with these, you're like, what? What is going on here? And you said, that is right, isn't it? That is standard, right? So in actual fact, does the cat need fed? Is Scots. In standard English, it would be, yeah, does the cat need feeding or does the cat need to be fed, right? And yes, what about, are you wanting to come with me? Do you want to come with me? Yeah, again, are you wanting, this is when stative verbs want, have, like, remember, love. We normally, in standard English, we can't put them in a progressive, an ing, but in Scots we can. Okay, so are you remembering your school books, etc.? What about I'm going to my bed? I'm going to bed, yeah. In Scots, we stick in a possessive pronoun in places that you can't in standard English. So what did you have for your tea? What did you get for your Christmas? Okay, and then the last one. Okay, you could change that. When are you back at school? Yeah, in Scots, for institutions like school, and for some sports. He went to the football. And illnesses, we stick a the in, it's called the definite article. So when are you back at school? And notice as well, folks, I'm saying stick in, that's a terrible linguistic description, because there are really clear rules in Scots as to where you can and can't do these things, right? Just like there are rules in Standard English, there are complete rules here in Scots as well. But the key point there is, that took a wee while, right? And that is because, except 100% in the front there. That is because, I'm struggling with this, I'm a Mac user and, no. Like, I obviously can't hold water and work the computer, let me put that down. That is because these are covert Scotticisms, they're hidden, right? And interestingly, if you're at the Scottish Standard English end of the continuum, you'll not likely say doon and hame and cared, but you will be using those. You will say, I'm going to my bed. Are you wanting a cup of tea, etc. So standard Scottish English speakers and Broad Scots do use these grammatical forms, these structural forms. We just don't know we're using them. They're below the level of consciousness. So again, that description of Scottish Standard English is English with a Scottish accent isn't quite right, because we're using all these grammatical forms at that side as well. So here, we wanted to ask about those to see who uses what where. And instead of saying, is it more like this, we use what we call grammaticality judgments. This is what we do as linguists. And we basically say to a person, does that sound okay to you? That's basically what we're doing, because even though we don't think overtly about this thing coming out of our mouths, we can tap into the rules if we're asked the right questions about them. So does this sound okay? So it looked like this, the question. So your friend is going to the cinema, she says, are you wanting to come with me? And you had a choice between, oh yeah, I'd say that sounds fine. To people around me say this, I've heard people elsewhere say this, versus never heard it before. These are grammaticality judgments. You say if the sentence sounds okay or not. And when we look at that, it's a reflection of what we saw here. Nearly 80% of people are saying, I'd use those, yeah, they sound fine, right? When we collected all of these sentence structures together. And a minority of people are saying, no, I would never say those things. And then again, when we divided it by region, we see this. And that shows you that regardless of where you are in Scotland, we're all doing the same thing. And crucially, so is the Highlands and the Western Isles. They're up at high rates as well of use of those forms. And we can see that, if we look visually at that, the whole of the country looks the same. And that looks very different to this, to this claim. Oh, I had a bit of excitement for you. That looks very different. So how difficult is it to use two fingers to, there we are. That looks very different to this, here's where Scots speakers are, right? So in the Western Isles and the Highlands, they're not using those iconic pronunciations, but they are Scots speakers of a kind, because they're using all these Scots grammatical structures. And we can see the difference between the pronunciation and sentence structure here. Difference across pronunciation, and I've spelt pronunciation wrong. It's really bad for a linguist to do that. But the sentence structure, it's all the same. So if we go back to this idea of who speaks Scots, it depends on where you're looking in the language. So all those books that say they practically ignore the Highlands and the Western Isles, we have to now start including those in descriptions of Scots to show really what is going on. And of course, the other thing about this is language is changing all the time. So it's It's so counterintuitive, but it absolutely never stands still. And you can tell that from, I call it the granny test. So I say to my students, do you sound different from your granny? Yes. That's language change, right? It's changing in the here and now. Of course it's changed from Chaucer and Shakespeare, but right here and right now, it's constantly tectonic plates, moving and moving. So this might have been a change. It might have been the case that they weren't using those structures in the past, and now they've begun to use them. Who knows? So that's who speaks Scots. So we now have a better picture of who speaks Scots where. How long have I got, Claire? Oh, don't give me the chance, please. Get your sleeping bags out. Okay, so a bit more audience participation, and with this one, I want you to say the words. This sounds really bad, but I'm going to show you words that begin with B, the B word. I'm going to show you the words that begin with B. I want you to say them out loud to yourself when you see them, and tell me if you pronounce them the same or different. There we are. Say them out loud. I love the hum that comes out of okay, so who pronounces them the same? And who pronounces them different? Okay, so the majority, well, it's probably about 65-35, say you pronounce them different. And for those that pronounce them different, can you say how they're different? Bang, exactly. So it's brood. Can you do them? Perfect example. The first one is a short, the vowel, and the second one is a longer vowel. And about 65% of you, that's very unmathematical, but the more people said they sound different to the people that said they sound the same. For the people that said they sounded the same, are you from Scotland? Okay, but I can forgive you for getting that one wrong. So the really interesting thing with this, folks, is across the whole of the English-speaking world, people pronounce those the same. And yet we have about 65% of you, the majority of you, pronouncing them differently, one shorter and one longer. So in Scotland, this is a very Scottish thing, and we do something different from the rest of the world with this. And why do we do that? What is this thing? Well, now you'll know, because every time you say those vowels from now on, you'll be like, oh, did I say it long enough? So this is called, folks, the Scottish vowel length rule. And it's a really, back to that complexity of language, it's a very complex rule as to why some are short or some are longer. And I'm going to give you a wee taster of that. So if you think of brood and brood, what's different about those? Sorry? Yeah, but that's the spelling, but there's something else connected to that that's different. Exactly. You notice with brood the beer, you can have brew plus ed. You can separate it. There's a word within that word, brew. Brew plus ed to make it past. Brood, a brood of chicks. You can't say bro. Well, you can say hey bro. You can't say broed or broody. It doesn't separate. Okay, this is called in linguistics a monomorpheme. So there's the linguistic difference is shown in the way we pronounce it in Scots. And with the second one, it can be to do with whether it's got two what we call morphemes, two parts to it, like brood the beer, or just one part. And the second one, bruise and bruce, it depends on if the following thing is what we call voiced. And if you say bruise, you can feel the vibrations, bruise. If you put your hands there, you feel the vibrations, bruise, bruise. But if you say the name, Bruce, there's much less vibration going on. And that, again, so Bruce is long and Bruce is shorter, okay? So there's many other rules to the Scottish vowel length rule, and we all use them beautifully without any effort. But if I would take about an hour to teach you about them all, and that shows the complexity of it. So the key thing with this is we saw about 65% here used that, and Aitken says all varieties of Scottish speech, from the fullest vernacular to educated Scottish Standard English, along the continuum, operate in some measure the Scottish vowel length rule. And this is a given for throughout Scotland. We have this vowel length rule, longer and shorter vowels, depending on the context in which it occurs. And if we look at what we found in the Speak for Yersel, by way the majority said, yeah, they sound different to me. They sound different. So every year I teach the Scottish vowel length rule to the first years, watch them glazing over as I give them another rule for it. Teach the Scottish vowel length rule. But I always had in my head, I was like, this is weird because I think I say brood and brood the same. I think they're the same for me. And I feel like a bad Scot because I don't have the Scottish vowel length rule. So then we looked again across region. Is it the case that everyone's using the Scottish vowel length rule? And you can see the one that sticks out there is the northeast, of course, home of Bucky. So in the northeast, it looks like we don't have the Scottish vowel length rule. Just got my little arrow here. Whoops. So amazingly, these small nuances of language, we can tap into them when you ask people about them. I bet 100% none of you have ever thought about the Scottish vowel length rule, right? Oh, I say that vowel longer. But yet we're able to tap into them in this quick and dirty crowdsourced data. And again, to show it visually here, the difference, the northeast looking different from the rest of the country. So it's like, phew, it's not only me. So I think I should probably maybe wind up in a minute, Claire. Yeah, so I'm going to skip past folks. I've got tons more, but I'm going to just skip past it. Okay, I'm quickly do this one. Where's the red squirrel? You're pointing it out. What would you say? It's there. Yeah. What's another way of saying it? If you move that one around. There it is. Yeah, there it is. Any other way in Scots? Yes. So there it's there, but also I love going in and hearing that, going into B&M and say, where's the Haribo? You say, they're there. But we also have this really interesting one, Verits. Who's a Verits user? Okay, where are you from? You're from Edinburgh. Okay, yes, it is. Looks like it started in Glasgow and it's spread to Edinburgh. Yeah, Verits. Who uses, oh, there it's there. More of you, okay? Who uses, there it is. Most of you. So we see this going down and down and down, more and more specific. I'm not going to go into details there, but basically we see that there is pretty much throughout Scotland. When people hear this, if you go to conferences and talk about this in Europe or something, they go, what? That's the strangest thing I've ever heard. Are you sure? Are you making that up? And then when they hear Verits, they're like, oh my God, mind blown. They just have never seen anything like that before. So basically what we did with that was we have face-to-face data and we compared it to this Speak for Yersel data, the findings here, and so this very carefully controlled face-to-face versus throwing it out in crowdsourced, and we found the same results for the geographic spread of there it's there versus there it's. I'll not show you that now, because that is far too much. So, Speak for Yourself is expanded, yay! So we just launched about a month ago, and we now have a Speak for Yourself for Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, and Wales. And of course, we had to have different questions because there are different things going on in those varieties. So they expanded. So does anyone watch Gavin and Stacey? Yeah, so you'll know the word for hug. Yeah, exactly. And there's the map for Cwtch. So you see the green dots are where they say, am I pronouncing it right? Is it Cwtch? Cwtch. So a lot of green dots, a lot of people saying Cwtch instead of hug. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you. Yes.
Can you explain why some of these regions are different?
Yeah.
Is it because of like influxes of people at some stage or what?
Yeah, so what you've got a quick history of Scots. So Scotland was Gaelic speaking, and then what you got was the boroughs moving up from England, and they started in the east coast, Edinburgh, and moved up through the east coast, and with the boroughs came English. Well, with the boroughs came, it started with Northumbrian English, moving across the border, although the border was a movable feast then, moving up and into Scotland. And then what you get, it goes further and further up, and the further away it becomes from that source, and the longer it's in a particular place, the more differentiated it becomes. So if you look at something like the northeast of Scotland, we know that that sounds really, really different, right, to the rest of Scotland. So you've got it, you get English, which became Scots, moving up there, and then developing its own, what we call norms of use, becoming its own variety of Scots, going off in its own way. It's a bit like, I always think about, it's a bit like, you know, animals in Australia. You've got all these really different animals because they're pitched out on their own there. So this is the reason why. So often things like geographic barriers can make you quite what we call a linguistic isolate. So you're not having contact with other people, so you start to do more and more your own thing. Yeah.
Is that tied into the fact that they speak Gaelic in the northeast as well?
So Doric comes from, it's a sister language with English, which started as a Germanic language, and then becomes English, and then you get this sister language arising. So Doric is part of that sister language of English, which then became Scots. Yeah. But often the further away you are from the centre, from the political centre, for example, or populous centres, the more different you are. Yeah. And then there's a whole other reason for Orkney and Shetland sounding so different. They used to be owned by Scandinavians, and Norn, a Scandinavian language, was spoken there. And then the Scottish king was given Shetland. I think it was a dowry or something. And you got Scots brought up to Shetland, but you get the two languages in contact over a period of about 150, 200 years. And then the Norn, the Scandinavian language, is pushed out because all the influences with the Scots. But in Scots, you still see all the traces of that contact in their language. So language contact can give you a huge amount of diversity as well.
Early on, you mentioned the test of do you sound like your granny or not?
Uh-huh.
And from an archaeological point of view, I'm interested because I've thought for a long time that grandmothers must have played an enormously important part in the development and stabilization of human languages. And I wonder if anyone's done any work on that. If you learn your language from your siblings, it's going to be a real scrambled mess. But if you learn it from your granny, you've stabilized it across 2 generations.
Oh.
And I wonder how that works.
Okay, yeah, that's at least 3 hours lectures. Those are really good, really good questions. So children start by sounding, when they're acquiring language, they start by sounding like their primary caregivers, and that's mostly their mums, right? They're the ones in the homes most of all. They start sounding like their primary caregivers. So the model for language comes from the mother. But then when the children go into school, they quickly start sounding like their peers, right? And this is where language change takes place. So there's no language change when you learn it from your mother. You're doing you're doing the same thing as that generation above you. And but then when you go to school, that's when language change starts taking place. But the thing about a scrambled mess, if you learn it from siblings, is simply not true. We know, so we have an attitude towards non-standard dialects, right? We think they're not right. Or we think it's an attempt to speak standard English gone wrong, can be one of the things that people think. But we know that a child cannot learn a standard language or a dialect if it's not highly, highly systematized. So just as like standard English, dialects have rules as well. And often, folks, the dialects have more systematized rules than standard English. And a really great example of that is, she's there, isn't she? They're there, aren't they? I'm there. What a beautiful thing that is. That should be the right one, right? That's much more systematized. Here's another one. My book, your book, his book. Myself, yourself. So dialects say his self, and that's right, right? If people were to go around saying him book, what? Him book is something else. That's spelled with a Y, right? So there's never a scrambled mess. So children when you look at the acquisition of, so one of the studies I did was, I was looking at how kids acquire a dialect alongside the standard, because if you remember I said this thing in Scotland, people are bidialectal, they can move from Scottish Standard English back and their own accent at home. So I wanted to look at how that comes about. So what I did was, I had caregivers, it was all mothers and their children. The children were all aged 3 to 4 years old, and I got them to record themselves for 10 hours in any situation. So they were like this, they had their little mics on and their little packs in the back. And I said, just go ahead and record yourselves. So they were making dinner, or they were getting dressed. There was a lot of muffling on the mic when they were getting dressed. They also went to the toilet. You heard all of that being recorded. And it was this really interactional data in Bucky. Where else would I do a research project? And what we found was that, very simplified, is that when caregivers were dressing their kid or making dinner for their kid or playing with their kid, they talked in dialect. So if you do day, put on a jumper now, get your gansy on, and then when they were teaching the kid, as caregivers do all the time, they spoke in Scottish Standard English. What's the colour? Is it brown? Is it brown? So immediately the kids are hearing, in those formative years of acquiring a language, they're doing this kind of amazing thing of, they're hearing 2 different forms of that language, but they're able to sort out from a really young age. When I'm laughing with my mammy and playing around, I can speak like us, but maybe if somebody comes in, we don't know them, I've got to start speaking like this. So it's a kind of amazing thing that kids do right from the very start, but it's highly systematized, highly, highly systematized. That's a very roundabout. I don't know if I answered your question. Sorry. Hello. Hiya.
No, so you are saying that Scots is a dialect and not a language?
Scots is a collection of dialects. So now, and of course, that I would say Scots is a language, but in Buckie it's a dialect of Scots. So Scots is the big umbrella term. And if we talked about this say 15 years ago, it was a dialect, but because language is always just a reflection of what's going on in society. There have been changes towards that, and people are now starting to talk about it as a language. When you look linguistically at the difference between languages, it's, so say, I don't know if anybody knows about the Scandinavian languages, you know, Danish, Swedish, yeah, they're completely mutually comprehensible, but they're all called different languages. So it's often a political thing, what you name someone, rather than an actual linguistic thing, yeah. I would say language now. Because if I say dialect, I'll go behind the parapets.
I take it that when you say you come from Buckie, you don't mean the fortified wine that is.
The students actually brought me a bottle for Christmas. I haven't drunk it, I would like to say. So when I introduced to the first year and I said, I'm from Buckie, and the titters throughout the lecture hall are hilarious. Oh, there's one and then you.
A move in written language and text speak, if you want to call it that, where you notice a migration in terms of particularly the younger generation using Americanisms or text speakisms.
Yeah, so there's always this idea that we're sounding becoming very globalized and sounding the same or becoming Americanized. But it's simply not true. If you step out in the streets of Glasgow or Aberdeen or Dundee, folk are still sounding like they're from Dundee or Aberdeen, etc. So what we can do with Americanisms is we're able to pick up words and phrases and copy those. Those are called off-the-shelf changes in our language. So you go into the linguistic sweetie shop and you go, I think I'll sound really cool if I start saying that, so I'll have one of those, please. So wicked, or, you know, a big one is awesome. You know, oh, awesome. It was about 20 years ago, I was in the States for a conference, and I was there with my American colleague, and we ordered a coffee, and she came with the coffees, and he said, that's awesome, thanks. I was like, what? It's like the most bonkers thing I'd ever, I was like, what do you mean? And now, of course, it's become a thing here. So that's an individual phrase, a word that we can pick up. But we're not going around saying sacks. And what else are they doing in the States? That. We're not doing that. So superficial things in our language, we can go into the sweetie shop and take it, the off the shelf. But generally, the language we first learned as a child and then continue to learn in school is our vernacular. It's very hard for us to take on these things. And again, the same with social media. So the fear that with text we're going to be speaking in text speak. People aren't going around going, seriously? You know, that's for seriously, seriously, we're not talking like that. We're still talking like, you know, we always talked. So changing all the time, for sure. But this idea we're all starting to sound the same just isn't right. And in fact, so there's definitely some things have come up from London, right? So one of those is what we call TH fronting, and that's think and teeth. And I don't know if you get that. And you see, I just saw that, the cringe from that. So that's definitely a change that's come up from London. It's swept through the country. But there's other things that we show in another project we did, and this one, where what we call homegrown changes. And one of those is use. So you don't hear use in London for plural you. Also, by the way, folks, super handy, because again, there's a gap in Standard English, most languages differentiate between you and yous. Most languages, French, for example, tu and vous. So there's a real gap in Standard, but we still cringe when we hear it. That one looks to have started in Glasgow, not London, and it's moved eastwards to Edinburgh, and it's even in Buckie. It's moved all the way up there. So there are the gonna you and gonna know, that is spreading as well, and the there's looks to be spreading. These are things you can't find out with Scotland, and out with's a great Scottish word, by the way. That's a covert Scotticism, out with. I was about 35 before I realised that was Scottish. So I think there was one there, yeah.
I had two observations. One was, particularly with the brood and brood,
Uh-huh.
I found it interesting because I teach synthetic phonics.
Okay.
And you make a very different sound from the oo to the oo.
Uh-huh.
You're teaching,
Interesting.
yeah. The other one was, you asked the kids here in school, where's your maths book? They'd go, it's they.
It's they, right.
It's they. Yeah.
Right.
G-Y, yeah, which was quite interesting. But I had another question. I wanted to know what. So a word that's commonly used here is jump.
Jump, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
So my question is that dialect or is that Scots? That kind of word?
yeah, you tend to not get jump. You do use as well, you get in Philadelphia, you get in little spots. Jamp, you do get, but it's really uncommon. It's really, in Scotland mostly, jamp. And jamp comes along because if you look at the history of English, all our verbs in past tense, in say Middle English, so we're going back to like 14th, 15th century, and even up to early modern English, they were almost, there was many, many more irregular verbs. So a regular verb is add ed, like brood, but irregular verb is go, went. Okay, you can't predict, you can't just add ed. And if you go back to Middle English, about 80% of verbs were irregular. But through time and through centuries, we start regularizing them, right? More of them become ed. But with something like jamp, they've gone the opposite, right? So at one point in the history of English, jump would not have been jumped. It would have been something like probably jamping. I need to look that up and see. So in a way, we've reverted to an irregular form there. Another example is, so I sneak into the room every day, and yesterday I... Yeah, who's a snock user here? You're so trendy. Because snuck is new. The one in the dictionary is sneaked. So you can see in our heads we're a wee bit confused about irregular verbs, right? We're a little bit confused. So we're kind of going both ways with that one. But that's jamp. Yeah, that tends to be Scots. Yeah. Yeah, nice observation.
Not American.
Sorry?
Snuck, I think of that as being American.
Yeah, so they started doing it first, and now we've started doing it. But so whether we got it for them or we would start doing it anyway is another question as well. Yeah, they're definitely ahead. If you look through time, say you take grannies, mums and dads and kids, the grannies will all be saying snuck in America, but here you might get them younger. You might get holdouts saying sneaked. Another one that's changing is dive. Dove. And why do you think that one's becoming dove? It's probably not American in that case. It's probably something to do with the language itself. Dive isn't a very common word, but drive is. Drive, drove, dive, dove. And that's what we call change by analogy. So the language looks to other things in the language and tries to make a pattern out of it.
Just wondering, is there an element in that of wanting to be super correct? And you think that the stuck sounds more correct, probably it's a better thing to say.
Absolutely, and that is, yeah, that's called hypercorrection. Yeah, exactly, it's a great example of hypercorrection.
When you gave it to Peter and I, which is completely illogical. But because we're taught so and so and I did something.
Yes.
And that's hypercorrection, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And that's a great example of how prescriptivism has absolutely messed with our language. Because he gave it to David and I as wrong, right, prescriptively, yeah. But we're overcorrecting because we see it as, Isle is a great example.
But presumably, in Scots or Broad Scots, people won't be too much worried about that kind of thing. They're not trying to impress that they're educated.
Yeah, and I mean, there is, again, it's that pool between, so there's two things going on with language. There's the thing that says the standard language is correct and it will get you a great job that pays you more money, right? And that is the idea of status. And that's a big pool for people, right? If I speak correctly, I'll get more money and a better job. But there's another thing goes on with language, and it's called solidarity, and that says, I want to sound like my mates down the pub, and I think I sound friendlier if I'm not doing this really correct, posh voice. I want to sound like the rest of the people. So the pool is two ways. If there was only a pool towards standard, I'll get a better job, we would all be sounding standard now. But there's not. There's a great attraction to the vernacular as well. It gives you other things.
And that attraction's become stronger. I mean, look internationally. You don't have to speak BBC English anymore. And in fact, the regional accents have become quite.
Exactly, and there's something really interesting happening there. So if you look, so it was all Queen's English, and then Radio Scotland came along, and it had a diversity of voices. But note the diversity of voices were very partitioned. So for the broadcaster with the news, they were Scottish Standard English, right? You think of our continuum, they were Scottish Standard English. But if you're, for what might you hear Broad Scots on Radio Scotland?
Off the ball.
Exactly, football commentary. So it's subliminally telling you it's okay to use that voice there, but not okay to use that voice there. And if we look on TV, we will find that the representation of the dialect speakers are either comedians or gangsters, right? But that is the thing that's changing. Did anybody watch Vigil? The submarine? It was pretty terrible, to be frank. But the really interesting thing about that is mostly all the voices, all the actors were Scottish, and just your ordinary guy on the submarine had a strong Glasgow accent. He was neither a comedian nor a criminal. And you can see, that shows you that there's a change going on in the perception of these different dialects.
I was just thinking there that because you've got this continuum, that if your job is an English teacher in Scotland trying to teach kids how to write English, you're trying to force them into navigating a continuum onto one pattern on written form, right? So it's quite a challenge, I would say.
Yeah. And we have standard written English for a reason. It's kind of functionally handy, right? Everyone does it. Yeah, it's there for a very good reason. Yeah. But interestingly, we're seeing Broad Scots was always a vernacular spoken form, but now we're seeing it all over the place. We're seeing it on social media, represented in writing, and also that whole new tranche of writers like Chris McQueer and Graham Tulloch, he did the Young Team, don't know, and they write like they speak. It's fascinating linguistically what they're doing, and because they write like they speak, it's completely systematized. It's quite weird when you first look at it, because we're not used to seeing that form, but then when you get into, this is what they're doing, as opposed to something like Hugh McDermott, don't know if his was a constructed Scots that no one ever spoke, and for that reason it was kind of all over the place linguistically. It's quite interesting. Because again, one, we think Hugh McDermott Scots right, and Chris McQueer is wrong, but actually when you look linguistically, it's the opposite. Yeah. But I think we have standard written English for a very good reason. Yeah.
One more.
For many years I lived and worked in Langholm.
Where?
Langholm.
Oh yes, uh-huh.
And we had a builder who was proper obnoxious. Absolutely not. Are you aware of the term massy? No?
No.
It just means very, very bumptious.
Okay.
So he had a Polish labourer called Johnny Brzezinski,
Uh-huh.
and they worked as a team. And the Polish labourer said to him, "You do a very good job, Ronnie. I don't think you do a good job, but you do a very good job." And Ronnie replied, "I can do anything." Whereupon the Polish labourer says, "Can't strike match on bar of soap. Can't kiss on arse."
I was afraid you were going to ask me more questions about Bucky.
Any more questions, or shall we wrap up?
Let them go, let them go.
Okay. David, say thank you. Sorry, I'll just go. Yeah, I'll get out of your way. There you go.
When I came to Perth in 1983, I was very fortunate because through the company of certain friends, I was given an immersion crash course in a very, very serious and very broad form of Scots. But I was also fortunate because I was sort of prepared for it, because I'd lived in various countries, learned various languages, and spent some time with Chaucer and people like that. So I was expecting, I'd learned that language is a sort of, it's a region in a multi-dimensional space, and every language is like that. So I especially enjoyed this evening seeing language mapped, because mapping is the right way to understand languages. There's no right and wrong place to be on a map, really. It just is, but it is where it is because of where it is. And so here this evening, where we are, here in Perth, which geographically is a very strange place on the interface of all sorts of things. And if you live here long enough, you'll realise just how strange it is. But, so here this evening, we've been given a really interesting view of the language that surrounds us in all its forms. And I'm sure that our most faithful and regular attender, Willie Suter over there, will have enjoyed it just as much as we did, and perhaps even more, because that's what he spent his life doing. But for the rest of us, I'd like us to thank our speaker in the usual way for opening our minds once more. Thank you.